All right, so you've been working on Flutter and
I've been using Flutter for a revision of the mobile app that I work on at Google, which is the AdWords mobile app. So if you buy ads from Google, you use currently our native Android and iOS app to check your campaigns on the go. So it gives you sort of a lightweight management interface for what could be very large advertising spends with Google.
So I think probably this, being a reactive conference, the top question that people are going to be thinking about is like, how does this compare to something like React Native? What's the analogy there?
I think you would use this, maybe not in preference to React Native, but the main technical difference is that React Native is driving the native UI system from JavaScript. So it's pushing basically commands across a bridge to operate the native UI system from the JavaScript interpreter. So a lot of the art of doing React Native, so I'm told, I haven't done it, I've done quite a bit of web React, but the art of that is minimizing your transits across that bridge so you have good performance. Flutter, on the other hand, keeps all of its operation, pretty much all of its operation, sort of in the Dart VM on its own side of that bridge. So it's using fairly low-level access to the graphics hardware to do its rendering, and the entire stack is built on top of that in Dart. And you have programmatic access to it, so you're not transiting this bridge as much. So that opens up the possibility of doing certain kinds of UI programming at a higher frame rate.
So along those lines, what does Flutter output? So in the sense that React Native is obviously binding to the existing kind of UI libraries. Right. Is Flutter just kind of compiling down to native code and driving everything itself?
It's exactly that. It's one analogy I like to draw is if you're familiar with the Unity game engine, it's the same general idea as you were writing in this other language against this other SDK and then producing a native application from it. And with your Unity applications, you have it has a cross-platform story because you're targeting the Unity SDKs, and it's the same thing with Flutter. You target the Flutter SDKs, and then you can largely from the same code base deploy to both iOS and Android.
So one of the questions here is that, this seems like something that Google has designed. Obviously, you probably need kind of the scale of Google to be able to reinvent everything from this level up. What are the benefits for a smaller company of using something like Flutter?
Well, I think with a smaller company, there's always what is going to give us the most leverage for what we're trying to do. So if your application is about the fluidity of the user experience, and you're a small team, but you want to target both iOS and Android. I mentioned the Hamilton app in my talk. That was done by a very small team at a digital ad agency in New York City. And they use the Firebase database system as well. So their entire app is architected around sort of live data updates from Firebase, and their UI is rendered with Flutter. So if you've got an application like that, you get a lot of leverage out of using Flutter. So I expected to see it being quite popular with digital agencies who want to do stuff really quickly and still have it feel and look really good and be really performant as a native application, and particularly if they've got sort of a separate side of the house doing web development, so they're kind of breaking up their development across teams that way. But generally, we're using it for like a mainstream mobile application. It's going to be, the AdWords application is kind of a business-to-business application. So if you're an advertiser, you open up this app and you can do all this work in it. So I don't see any impediment to writing those kinds of applications with Flutter. I kind of went over the benefits of using it in the talk. But we've got a single API surface and a single programming language, and we're able to sort of bring the two halves of our team back together. We're all sitting in the same area, but half of us work on iOS and half of us work on Android, and it's nice to finally be able to talk with my coworkers about a specific piece of code that we are actually both using and working on.
So kind of along those lines, how critical to making this work is Dart?
So the story I've been told by the Flutter team, and these guys are not, non-web developers. Like two of the founders worked on WebKit and Blink and Chrome, and the other one was the editor of the HTML spec for 10 years. So these are like serious web UI guys. And you just asked me a question.
How critical is Dart?
The Dart language. So what I've been told is they started out with JavaScript and they tried to make it work twice. And the architecture of the UI system was you're always effectively allocating new objects as you rebuild your widget tree. So you're potentially allocating, thousands or millions of objects every frame. And the Dart virtual machines garbage collection system is so much more efficient that that particular kind of thing just works much better. So they tried to it, and they were able to take the Dart language and move. They were going to take more of a React Native approach to this. They were going to have a lot more machinery running on the sort of C++ side of things, but they realized that Dart would be fast enough that they could bring it all into the Dart side of the house. So a lot of these things I was talking about as an advantage for Flutter are because they were able to program more in the Dart language.
So, I mean, Flutter is such a kind of full stack encapsulating approach. What does it look like if I want to be able to pull in some native dependencies or rely on some existing library that isn't in Dart?
Well, what you can do is you can use, Flutter has a plugin systems where you can take a native piece of code and then through a fairly simple messaging interface connect it to Dart. And then expose whatever kind of Dart API you think is idiomatic for what you want to do. So we're doing that in our application. We're not only using it to talk to native services, but we're using it to talk to what I will now call legacy native libraries that do quite a number of things. And they'll even bring up their own UI and do some operation, and then you'll get a message back on the Dart side with, for example, the OAuth token for our first-party sign-in library. So that's one way. You can also go the other way that we typically don't. A Flutter application is just a single window in the native operating system, and it's doing all of the Flutter views are all just things going on. As far as the native app is concerned, it's just a hardware-accelerated graphics surface that receives input. So you could bring up a Flutter application in its own view in your native application if you want to try it out for some subsection of your application. There's not a lot of example code of doing that, but I don't see any reason why you couldn't if you want to invert it. Instead of having an all Flutter application with a few native plugins, you could go the other way.
So again, with Flutter, I mean, Flutter is driving everything down to the individual pixel, right?
That's right.
This is a full stack. How does that affect something like, there's a question here about whether or not are plans to target desktop platforms and kind of the work involved for that. You would have to be able to create everything from the ground up to work on something like Windows and OS X and whatnot.
That's right. Though that, I'm not going to pre-announce any Flutter plans. Flutter is expressly we are just doing mobile, man. It's we're not going to do web, we're not going to do desktop. But conceptually, all you would have to port is that bottom layer, the Dart UI layer. And even the C++ portion of that, since it's largely extracted from Chrome, which is itself a cross-platform code base, that should be a pretty straight port. So, Flutter is open source. I encourage you all to try and contribute pull requests back to the Flutter project. So it's hey, there's Flutter desktop now, and this guy who doesn't even work at Google wrote it. So I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be possible.
So you showed some pretty cool bits of code with the streams and being able to implement everything from these primitives up. What does it look like to describe a UI in Flutter? And is there any plans to introduce some sugar, kind of like JSX or something along these lines?
Well, there's no reason you couldn't write that sugaring layer, though it's pretty declarative code. I mean, you're just new widget, child, new widget, child, new widget, children. So by not introducing this other kind of conceptual representation of your user interface, you actually don't have to context switch between them. I don't know if anyone's ever found it necessary to do non-JSX React, but it's actually not that bad. And similarly, Flutter is very is very ergonomic, and you're okay, it's code, it's code, it's code, it's code, it's UI. So don't knock it till you tried it. It's not that hard.
Yeah, fair enough. Keep an open mind. That's
yeah. It's actually, and I often find one of my little personal things that I rant about is web templating systems. I'm always upset by them, and I'm very happy with JSX because JSX is just a sugaring layer on JavaScript, and you always need to do some UI, some logic to render your UI. That's purely UI related stuff, and the Flutter widget build function is just a function. You can do whatever you want in there to construct your UI. So we'll call helper functions that build a portion of the UI and then return the results of those functions in our fully built up widget. So you can compose functions to do your top level widget build if you're building something complex.
So one of the trade-offs that comes with like having so much power in this is it makes tooling much more difficult. And so React Native and React, the ecosystem, has a lot of tooling that's kind of already there. Can you kind of speak to what the tooling in the ecosystem looks like for Flutter?
Why, I'm glad you asked that, Sean.
Okay.
So one of the nice things about Dart is it runs in dev mode, it runs a headless server in your running application, and you can connect to it from a web browser, and it's got quite detailed statistics about what's going on with Dart. But that's also like an HTTP API, so your development tooling can talk over that API to the running Dart virtual machine. And Google, working with JetBrains, has developed plugins for IntelliJ that will give you, source code level debugging and variable inspection and so on inside of IntelliJ. And you can do all the things you'd want to do in a typed language IDE. You can command click on things and jump around. But there are other open source projects that talk to the Dart debugging API. So you can use it from inside of Atom. And I think there's quite a good one for Visual Studio Code as well. And you can write your own. So there's good tooling there. There's more tooling coming. I don't know if you've ever seen like sort of the visual inspectors that Xcode gives you, where you can like look at your UI and click through the hierarchy and see how the components are constructed. So there's more of that kind of tooling coming online. As I mentioned, Flutter has just officially went alpha a few months ago, and while it's still quite polished for a product that's early on, these things are coming online. So I'd expect to see more and more of that stuff coming.
How is the because it is so new, how is the third-party ecosystem? Right? Are there a lot of third-party plugins or packages and whatnot, or is it primarily kind of?
Well, I think Google is still driving Flutter pretty heavily, but one thing I will say is because it's based in Dart. Dart got a big push from Google a while back as maybe an alternative, a higher performance alternative to JavaScript in the web browser. And that wasn't really successful, but they continued to use Dart as a production language for our web developers, because a lot of them were coming from environments where they really wanted, like, we've got a gigantic team and we want a lot of static typing support. So mainstream Dart, if you go into the dartlang.org page, it talks a lot about the Dart dev compiler, which is actually a Babel-style transpiler. And it emits fairly readable JavaScript, which is used with Angular Dart. So a lot of that code has, some of that code is Angular specific, but a lot of it is not. So there's quite a lot of Dart code that you can use directly with your Flutter application that was maybe originally written as sort of logical bindings that you could use from within Angular Dart, but you can also use them in Flutter. So there's a big ecosystem of that. In fact, some of the stuff I was mentioning in my talk, like the RX Dart implementation and the Redux implementation for Dart were originally written by people who had been using Angular Dart for various reasons, and some of them weren't even Google engineers. So there's an ecosystem there. It's not as gigantic as JavaScript currently is, but you aren't having a cold start. You actually have some code you can look at and some people in the community that you can communicate with on the Dart and Flutter Gitters. That's the main live chat channel is on Gitter.
Since Google is kind of the driving force here and is re-implementing everything from the ground up, am I able to use kind of the native bits like cameras and sensors and whatnot? Is that already?
Yeah, I think most of the things that you're going to want to do, like the things that most developers will want to do, are going to be exposed as pre-written plugins. There's a number of them available, and we're writing more, and third parties are starting to write more of them. You haven't asked what Flutter can't do, so I should mention that as a caveat for anyone who's like, "This is great. I'm going to use it right away with, I'm going to embed a video and I'm going to embed the Google Maps from the Google Maps API," and that kind of interleaving of Flutter UI and native UI views is not something that Flutter supports right now. You can go to a full screen or a full view that has your native stuff in it, but you can't currently mix and match them. And I know that there's some efforts to address that, but that the current state of the world is like, if you want a Flutter UI, it's just going to be Flutter stuff.
So it does seem kind of in many ways like an all or nothing proposition. Like
No.
there is some bits of that, of bridging and whatnot, but how would you, I mean, even with down to the language level, right? So buying into Dart, coming from say JavaScript or TypeScript or something like that, how would you pitch this to someone who's coming from React Native and JavaScript and whatnot? How would you pitch them on Dart and Flutter?
I don't know if I would go in, if you're using ES 2017 syntax with, TypeScript or Flow, I would say you're going to have a comparable experience with Dart. It's a fairly modern language. It has await async, it has generators, it has generic types, it has, functions as first-class objects. It has no primitive types, like everything is conceptually an object. So it's a fairly modern language. It's also, one of the Flutter engineering team founders said, yeah, Dart's kind of a boring language. So it's not a particularly surprising language, and it has a lot of nice syntactic sugar. So I don't think Dart should prevent you from looking at Flutter. If you're coming from, I would say maybe the more of the immediate competition is if you're coming from native mobile development, Flutter's a much more pleasant experience. So if you can't sell your team on bringing JavaScript into their native apps for whatever reason, Flutter might actually be a more appealing solution because you can do more with a smaller team, and you also get really good runtime performance.
Interesting. So along those lines, can you kind of speak to the degree of code reuse you get across these different platforms?
Oh, the two platforms that you can target right now with Flutter are iOS and Android. And, it's going to be, if you don't have to do something that's like only on the native platform, if you've got a plugin for it, you can get, high 90s, almost all of your code. Certainly all of your sort of application level code, application logic, UI code is going to be shared across platforms. And you can address platform differences. Like in one of the demos, if you go watch the talk that Eric Seidel did about Flutter at Strange Loop recently, it's a really good deep dive on Flutter itself. But one of the standard demos is to show overscroll behavior in a list. So if you're towards the end of a list on Android, you get this kind of glow at the bottom, and if you're on iOS and you do the same gesture, it'll kind of bounce. And it preserves those kind of platform differences across the Flutter applications, but you as an application developer only have to worry about the, semantically loading up your virtual list or your scrolling list and rendering its contents, and that's going to be rendered pixel per pixel on both platforms, within the limits of graphics hardware.
So in this case, we're relying on effectively Google to re-implement these behaviors. So
That's right.
on both platforms. That goes for things like accessibility as well. It's like, how do you actually, how is Flutter kind of approaching the accessibility problems?
Well, they've just been landing a lot of code related to accessibility and right-to-left text because we have to have that stuff before we can ship our app. So we've been like, yeah, you got to do this. But they've done it before for Chrome and WebKit and so on. I haven't even read those APIs because they've been changing a lot recently, but they really did just land a bunch of stuff. But essentially what they're doing is you can kind of semantically decorate your widgets, and that decoration interacts with a native accessibility system. So when you gesture on a widget, it will talk to the native screen reader. So you should be able to do full accessibility with the Flutter. But that's code that literally just landed in the last few weeks. So go read the APIs, and then you will know more than I do.
There's kind of a general question here about, I don't know if you can speak to maybe the, whether or not the web will ever become like a full ecosystem comparable maybe to the kind of native experience. I know Flutter is purely a native mobile targeted thing.
Well, I started at Google as a web developer, and I sought it out particularly to do web development. I'm actually a big believer in the web, but I had a chance to do some native development. I thought that would be kind of fun to do. Google's also working on progressive web applications. So if you want the reach of a web application, we're doing a lot of stuff that is important to the web as a platform. So if you follow my friend Alex Russell, slightly late on Twitter, he's he just published a great thing about performance benchmarking. And he's got examples that are both reactive API examples and using things like web components and service workers, and so like fundamental web technologies. So I think Google finds a lot of its leverage technically in support of the platform through its work with Chrome. So you can, the things that we can get into Chrome and can get standardized that make the platform itself better are really going to help everyone who's working, whether you're using React or Vue or any of these other frameworks. If you can, use a service worker to cache your data, for example, so you can have a good offline experience. So, I think it's a both and thing. Sometimes you're going to need to pick a different set of technologies depending on the needs of your application. So a lot of people are like, yeah, I'm gonna just do a web application, and that's completely the right thing to do for their users. You have to be connected to the net, or you can use native caching in the web browser. But maybe you want to have different kinds of interaction models that are a little harder to implement as web UIs at the moment. And then you will be able to, in 2-3 years, and then you'll be able to do something else only on native systems or systems that have kind of native level access. So it's a spectrum of development, and Google has products kind of at all stages along that line.
It does seem very nice that there's a lot of opportunity, I guess, for kind of osmosis between these teams and whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just as a side note, I mean, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and someone will pass out a mic, and we'll just keep going along this in the meantime, though. Are there any reassurances you might be able to give in terms of someone who, from the outside, might be nervous to adopt something that Google might throw away, even so Dart or Flutter?
I can talk about the potential for inertia with Dart and Flutter, and this is a question that I ask myself, and I'm always you work inside of a large technology organization like Google, and part of your effectiveness is based on how well you understand the internal tooling that may or may not be used outside of Google. And when you have a chance to work on something that is available outside of Google, you go like, great, this is like a little potential security for me if I ever want to work somewhere else. Why would you? But if you did. So the things I can say about Dart and Flutter, even though we didn't end up incorporating Dart as a programming language you could use inside of the web browser, we wrote the Dart dev compiler, which is a transpiler from Dart to JavaScript. So, and using that, we developed Angular Dart. So there's a gigantic system of Angular Dart code inside of Google with the product that our advertisers use to spend literally billions of dollars with us. So Dart's not going away. That is a many years code base that's being used for the front end of the AdWords app at Google.
That does seem very reassuring.
Yeah, and in addition to that, in addition to those billions of dollars, Flutter is not just being used for iOS and Android development. There's a project called Turquoise, which is sort of a next-gen mobile operating system, which is also open source, and it's kind of got more of a microkernel approach to the native OS part of it, or the underlying OS. But its UI system is also written in Flutter with a different set of widgets. So it's not just this material design or iOS style widgets. It's its own thing, and it's got its own capabilities. So Flutter is getting investment from other areas of the company. It's not just ads for this one kind of specialized case. Yeah.
There's a question here about having an exclusive. It's not proprietary, but it is kind of. There is one kind of powerhouse behind it. Mm-hmm. An exclusive kind of full stack SDK is usually a bit of a constraint on teams, right? So one that you might want to avoid. There's kind of high infrastructure costs associated with if this goes away or something along those lines. Is there a benefit to kind of this full stack approach?
Well, yes. I don't know if anyone here has done Android and iOS development together or worked on teams that are doing both kinds of development. One of the, I'm not going to slam Android. It's extremely successful. You should all target Android. But one thing that Android developers have to deal with that iOS developers don't have to deal with as much is version skew across devices and manufacturers. You know, there are in the wild many versions of Android that people end up having to support on many different kinds of hardware, and iOS doesn't have that because Apple controls things pretty tightly, and Flutter's kind of in between. So you get the advantage of sort of like there being one version of Flutter. It's not forked. It's forkable. I mean, it's open source. You could do that, but you probably don't want to. Just there's one API surface, and then it's a really responsive team, and they're a very friendly team. So you can talk to them on Gitter as you develop your own opinion about how Flutter should work, and you can submit pull requests and so on. So you have a stake in how Flutter could develop, and that was also like a risk mitigation thing. It's like even if Google for some reason thought that they needed to drop Dart and Flutter, like C++ source code is open source, the Dart source code is open source. You know, you can keep it all on your own repository and keep going if you really feel you must.
I think one thing you mentioned beforehand is kind of Flutter takes the look and feel of its own style, right? It's not necessarily trying to mimic the native look.
Well, what it's doing, it does mimic the native look for iOS in certain cases. Right. So it's just we don't want to have people having the experience of like, well, I tried it on iOS and it just looks like, you know, some other weird Google thing. It's like, no, it looks like an iOS app. The default design language is material design, so you know that's that Google, you know, the default Android material design look. But the specifics are kind of native to the platform. But you really can rewrite that stuff and override it. You can skin it and theme it to your heart's content, and you've got pretty powerful abstractions in the way you compose widgets to be able to override default behavior in your application, including things like animation and curves and the whole bit.
Yeah, I think the Strange Loop talk did a good job of kind of showing just how flexible it is. All right, I think that's probably all we have time for. Thank you very much. Please thank Gavin for his time.